Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 21st, and we will hear the presentation, Monuments of the Future, Planning for a More Equitable Public Space. For questions related to the presentation, so content questions, or if you have any technical questions, just go ahead and type those in the Q&A. I'll do my best to answer those technical questions. For your content questions, we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A, but feel free to type those questions in now as you think of them. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2023. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a joint effort of two divisions, the Urban Design and Preservation Division and the Arts and Planning Division, which you'll hear about both of them in just a moment. So thanks to you both for joining today. Our next three upcoming webcasts are up on your screen. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits and 1 equity credit. You can log those credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, and both the title and event number can be found on our website in case you're having trouble searching. I know sometimes the search function to record your CMs is a little funky. So you can get the title and the event number off of our website. Again, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where we post any important date or time changes. We post when new sessions are available for you to register for. And then we also, on Monday or Tuesday, we post a reminder of the Friday's webcast. Also, head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. We record all of our sessions and post them onto our YouTube channel. So if you head over there now, you will see our well over 400 session recordings that we have available, all for free. So be sure to subscribe so you get notified when new sessions are put up onto our YouTube page. So that's it. Again, reminder, just type your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them. We'll get to them at the end during the designated Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn things over, here we go, to Brittany Delaney of the Arts and Planning Division. Can you see my screen? Are we good to go? Can you see everything, Brittany?
I can see you and I can see my friends.
Okay.
Lauren and Paul. I don't see. How about you, Lauren? Can you see the screen?
Yeah, and we're getting some comments and that we can't see slides.
All right, hold on. Let me try this. Sometimes it happens. Hold on. Let me try something else here. Technology. All right, we're going to try this one. Can you see it now?
It says that you started sharing, but you don't see anything.
It says, oh, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
There it is. Thank you so much.
You guys, technology today. It's just not on my side. I literally did the same thing again. What I did before, I just did again, and now it's working. All right. Go for it, Brittany.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we will be adaptive and keep our sense of humor when technology fails. To me, it's not a Zoom unless there's a little bit of failure. So I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Brittany Delaney. I am the secretary for the Arts and Planning Division. And I have our big, bold mission right on our first slide. It's very simple: to transform the planning profession through arts and culture. So next slide. We're really excited today to co-sponsor this webcast. I put our smiling faces up on the second slide. Be curious, meet us on LinkedIn, follow us in the interwebs. We're very friendly and we have a very beautiful, diverse background. Some of us are artists, some of us are planners, some of us are both. But we come to this work with a real commitment to equity, a real commitment to transformation and collaboration. So one of the reasons I joined this division was because I was introduced to this work through my colleague, Miguel Vasquez. And if you know Miguel, you know he's a real kind of trend starter and collaborative human. So I want to thank him for introducing me to APA. Cheryl is also one of the persons that I've gotten to know to learn more about planning, but I'm really excited to welcome you to learn more about us if you haven't heard about us. Next slide, please. And as you can see, we're a fun bunch. Here is a picture from one of our events at the National Planning Conference in 2022 when it was held in San Diego. This year in 2023, we held a social with our friends at the David Rubin Land Collective. And we partnered with Monument Lab, Public Sphere Projects, Harvard's Grad School of Design. And it was really, really special. We called it Art and Soul to really capture the Philly soul culture there. And then we have another upcoming event for the National Planning Conference, but this one is online. And Claudia will be doing a presentation about climate change and creativity and planning. Also, put it on your calendar if you don't have it yet. The Creative Placemaking Leadership Summit is coming up in May, and one of our board members is super involved with creative placemaking. So we worked out a collaboration to give our APD members a 50% discount. So yeah, there's tons of other events and activities that we like to host. So just follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter. And then the last slide just has our website and another pretty photo to get inspired for the day. All right, I'll pass it over to Lauren. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Trice. I'm the interim webinar coordinator for the Urban Design and Preservation Division. I'm also super thrilled to be talking about monuments today because I will be starting next month as the project coordinator for monuments across Appalachian Virginia. And today, in my role as the Urban Design and Preservation Division, I want to tell you more about what we've got going on. We are a division that embraces the past and future of our built environment. And I think that's my next slide, Chris. So, yes, and then we can move on. We also promote the importance of design excellence and equitable public realm in the stewardship of our historic places. And next slide, our upcoming events, we have a wonderful partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to do a two-part webinar series. This is entitled Planning, Preservation, and Change. The first of this is next week, and this is hosted by the National Trust, and it is a panel of planners talking to preservationists. And then on May 19th, we have a panel of preservationists talking to planners, and that will be here with the planning webcast series. So we hope that you're able to join us on both of those. I think it'll be really great to do them both together, and you'll get to hear some different perspectives. 5 years ago, the division hosted a panel discussion on monument removal at the APA conference in New Orleans. There has been a lot that has happened since that conversation. And I'm so excited to have Paul Farber here with us today to help update us on what has been going on. And he is the co-director of the Monument Lab in Philadelphia. And he has worked on a National Monument Audit, which he'll share the findings with us today. But more interesting and more of a guide for what we're doing now is his newest project, the Regeneration Project, which asks the question, what stories do we want to tell in the public space? Which stories should be told in the public space? And this is a great conversation for planners to get involved with, as well as artists, designers, preservationists. And also, I would like to put in a plug that Paul has a really great podcast called Plot of Land, which I have been listening to. So I encourage you to do that as well. Without any further ado, I will hand it over to Paul.
Thank you for that. And good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday. I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to assume that everyone can see. So just to start, I'm Paul Farber. I'm the director and one of the co-founders of Monument Lab. And just thank you today for joining. Thank you to APA, and of course to Marcella Costa of NCPC, to Christine, Lauren, Brittany, and all of the colleagues at the Urban Design and Preservation Division and Arts and Planning. It's a really wonderful opportunity to engage. Today, I'm going to be telling you about the work of Monument Lab. I'm going to be sharing a lot about our National Monument Audit, including overview findings and the calls to action. This is an audit that we produced with the Mellon Foundation and released in 2021 in the fall, and it still feels very present today. And then we're also going to share some examples of our collaborations with artists on prototype monuments. And this question, monuments of the future, what comes next? And I think just to note, a phrase that we often say to ourselves with Monument Lab, now is the future is now. Past, present, and future as temporalities blur, time moves in circles. And so as we talk about the future, we're always, of course, talking about time coming together, and there's no kind of better way for us to think through monument as that combination of past, present, and future. Before I dive into my talk, I want to kind of give two overview notes for you. So one of them, I'm going to be talking a lot about the work of Monument Lab. I represent a team of people. We're headquartered in Philadelphia. We're a nonprofit public art and history studio, but we have teammates and colleagues in New Orleans and New York City, in Dallas and the West Coast. I think we work across 5 time zones now. And so as I'm here, the reason I'm able to be here is because there's a big group of people doing work on our behalf in all those places. When it comes to the audit, credit where credit is due, I co-directed the audit alongside my dear colleagues Sue Mobley and Lori Allen, and a big team of collaborators. You can read the whole credits list on our website, and especially to acknowledge the support of the Mellon Foundation in creating the National Monument Audit and the regeneration projects. The next request I have for you before I dive in, we like to have conversations and build relationships and dynamics. So if you have a phone or a device, go ahead and follow us on social, monument_lab. And we really want to be able to keep engaged with you and keep in conversation there. So if you can follow us, that does a great service to doing our work. So I'm going to be talking about the audit, which is this landmark document, the first of its kind. I want to walk through the overview. For those who haven't gotten a copy yet, it's free on our website. You can go to our website, monumentlab.com/audit, or you can order a print copy as well. But before diving into the audit, I want to talk to you a little bit about who we are. So I'm here representing Monument Lab. As I said, we're a nonprofit public art and history studio. We work with artists, students, educators, municipal agencies, and cultural institutions on participatory approaches to public engagement and collective memory. Almost a decade ago, we began as a classroom project with myself and co-founder Ken Lung. Over the years, our work has grown. At the center of our practice with monuments is a goal to unfreeze them, to connect them to understandings of our symbols and our systems of power, and contribute to a future society defined by joy, regeneration, and repair. As a research and curatorial team, questions are at the heart of everything we do. We believe that art is critical to how we understand and experience the past, present, and future. We believe that wisdom and intelligence comes in many forms. We like to ask questions that don't have a simple answer, but may have a multitude of possibilities. And we believe that can guide us toward greater forms of accountability and coalition building in the public realm. We value process as much as outcome, and we collaborate to make generational change in the ways that art and history live in public. We do exhibitions, participatory research projects, editorial platforms, As noted, we have a series of podcasts, including our Plot of Land series led by Sue Mobley, and a recent collaboration with NPR called The Statue, about the most famous Philadelphian who never lived, Rocky Balboa. And I share all this because when we think about monument, as we'll talk a lot more about in this webinar, we're really talking expansively. We're talking about what's in the public realm, and we're also talking about what's in our mindsets. How our ideas about preservation, conservation, but also power, equity, belonging have been shaped on and off the pedestal. So we, as a country, are at a moment of struggle over our monuments, and that reflects larger struggles over national identity and ideology. And this moment of prolonged monumental reckoning and reimagining, it is profound, but it is not new. The evolution of our monument landscape and the debates about it are as old as the nation itself. You know, monuments are paradoxical. They're central to our civic landscapes, to our cities and towns, and occasionally to the national conversations. But they remain elusive to define. There is no single definition that is agreed upon of what a monument is. There's nothing inherently that is a monument. There are things that we call monuments, convey status, resources, preservation, support. And that unstable nature of the term is a reminder that power to convey stories of the past, they can't be limited to any one single art form, outlet, or voice. So what is a monument? I can tell you that Monument Lab, through tens of thousands of conversations in public spaces across this country, we've come to define monuments as statements of power and presence in public. Statements of power and presence in public. And we've come up with that to accommodate the idea of bronze and marble symbols on high, historical traces and ruins and architecture, as well as the expressive layers of poetry, of projection, of protest. That if you have the time, the money, and the official power to build something that gets to monumental status, you do that because it protects your place in society. It's the way you make your presence known. But if you don't have the time, the money, or the official power, you have power nonetheless. You gather around monuments that exist, or you build your own, and that is how you make your presence felt. You know, as we think about what a monument is, as I noted, the word monument isn't a stable thing. We're thinking all the time about symbols on pedestals. At the same time, we're thinking about ecological formations or unintentional monuments. I think for us, we really view the idea in our work, as you'll see, around prototype monuments. Monuments that remind us through artwork, through engagement, that all monuments in their own ways are prototypes. They're not meant to last forever, even if they have the aura of that or give us that promise. And so perhaps we can really think the idea of permanence in of itself and understand how we're always in process. So as we collected our data for the, sorry, let me go back here. As we collected our data for the audit, and in certainly every talk that we've given about it, I do want to pull up this idea that often comes out as a central misconception, that there is some central government agency or body out there that just is in charge of all the monuments, that tracks them, that knows when they're built, where they're located, to whom or to what they're dedicated. And as many people here may know, but it's worth repeating, there is nothing like that in the truth of the matter. There's no central system for tracking, maintaining, or understanding monuments. There's no exhaustive list waiting to be discovered and put into a search engine like Google Monument. There are no troves of monumental data waiting to just be accessed and analyzed. There's no one you can petition in a holistic way, perhaps at the municipal level, the institutional level, the state level. There's no one body that says, let's remove this toxic monument or let's add another that might be healing. But that's often the way that our public discourse plays out. What there are a lot of data keepers, governmental, institutional, informal, who have kept track of all sorts of things in the built environment, some of which happen to be what we call conventional monuments. So when we were approaching the audit, my colleagues and I were looking to find a way to see overarching patterns and themes But we had to shape our audit through other sources to arrive at a snapshot of close to 50,000 conventional monuments across every US state, territories, numerous tribal nations. And to just give you a sense of that, for our audit, we gathered existing data from sources. We incorporated eventually 42 separate and representative data sources that in of themselves consisted of nearly 500,000 records, which were not designed to tell us about monuments per se, but they included data valuable for this audit. So public assets such as historic markers, outdoor sculptures, historic properties, sites, and buildings. Before I go into any of the findings, which I'll walk us through, I want to dive into the process and talk about the way that we formed a study set and break down each of this. And for those methodology folks out there or people who want to go to the data, I recommend that you can see our full methodology, access our GitHub at monumentlab.com/audit. So our first step when we were given the call to do this audit was to explore. With a team of nearly 30 researchers who never got to sit in the same room together because we began in the fall of 2020 in the throes of the pandemic, we aimed to gather together that team, people who would have different kinds of skill sets and questions that they could bring to bear. And we scoured almost 500,000 records. Those records were created by and maintained by federal, state, local, tribal, institutional, and publicly assembled sources. Again, not necessarily designed to primarily track monuments. So then we gathered. So our criteria for inclusion were data sources that we could use legally. And for this purpose, we enlisted Harvard Cyber Law Clinic as legal advisors. We looked for data that was officially produced, represented, a designated area, and was available in Excel, ArcGIS, shapefile, or a CSV format. We then connected. From this vast trove of data, we wanted to build a single study set. Imagine all the different kinds of data and the way it's formed, put it into one spreadsheet or system. We applied rigorous algorithms to filter out non-conventional monuments, to deduplicate entries and streamline our records. We iterated, we tested, we tweaked. So each monument record gives some insights, potentially to title, location, dates, metadata. But I want to be really clear that there are huge gaps in the records that we encountered. For example, only 6 of the 42 data sets even tracked race or gender. And we needed to understand how our data sources could speak to each other as a way to also address the gaps. Analyze. A large part of the work of the audit was accessing, converting, parsing, and mapping the data into that single standardized data set. We worked to create a top 50 list of individuals with recorded monuments, which I'll talk more about, and to have a database that we could ask questions of. And then finally to share. So as we closed out the work of building our study set, we did focus groups with monument scholars, high school teachers, municipal workers, people whose lives are impacted by this data. And then we prepared our findings for the Mellon Foundation. In the fall of 2021, we released this audit in cooperation with Dr. Elizabeth Alexander and the team at Mellon's Monuments Project, and have shared this far and wide. We've shared it with public officials, federal agencies, high school students, people in other countries. We've gotten calls from a public art office in Estonia, another one in Latin America, and just thinking about what it means to look at American monuments, but in a context that pushes out. So I encourage you all to read and search and engage outside of this webinar as well. So now that we've discussed the methodology, I want to go to the key findings in our study set. I'll read them out in a moment. But before I do, I want you to just do a mental exercise. So wherever you are in your mind, looking out the window, try to meander through your own city or town or region. You could traverse the National Mall and consider through your own experiences how any of these findings and what I'm about to share syncs up with what you have seen, what you have felt, what you've experienced. So for our findings, number 1, monuments have always changed. 2, the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. 3, the most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And then finally, the story of the United States as told by our monuments misrepresents our history. Monuments have always changed. The National Monument Audit reinforced that monuments are not timeless, permanent, or untouchable. Collected records, many of them from NPS, highlight changes through several factors, including dates created, dates dedicated, dates altered, added to, removed, as well as reports calling for maintenance that detail decay, disrepair, and other routine kinds of damage. Each and every monument changes over time. Many are made to last with enduring quality, but they are not made to last forever. In each of your municipalities, I wonder how you define permanent. Does permanent have built into it a certain time frame for maintenance? Does it matter by material? From sandstone to bronze to marble. And just to remind us that monuments require people to dedicate money as well as expertise to preserve and repair them, to keep them, quote unquote, permanent. We know this empirically, but this point often gets downplayed in our consideration of monuments across the board. So our call to action here, as we remember that monuments require maintenance, money, and mindsets to keep them standing, is to build a new, deeper understanding of how monuments live and function in communities. Examine the forces that drive their installation and upkeep in relation to civic power, and reflect on how and why they evolve over time. And here, that call to action is shown alongside a collaboration Monument Lab did with the artist Tanya Bruguera, a monument to new immigrants, as she titled it, made from unfired clay, which weathered over time to honor presence and sacrifice and loss in the story of immigrants in this country. This is a compelling project to us, but just a reminder that many monuments might look like this if it wasn't for the kinds of maintenance that goes to them. And so this monument also doubles as an insight into the precarity of our monument landscape. The next finding, the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male, but you probably knew that already. So the commemorative landscape is dominated by monuments to figures who would be considered white, male, and wealthy in our common understandings today. So we tracked this top 50 list of individuals with recorded monuments in our study set. You can read that full list on our website and in the audit. But again, just to note as you see this, that of this top 50, 44 or 88% occupy in the terms we would use today, the role of white men. So when we look at this top 50, we see some patterns across the list. So one is that there are 11 US presidents in the top 50 and 12 US generals. If someone just served in the Confederate Army as a general, we did not include them. They were fighting to dissolve the United States. More than a third, 40%, were born into wealth, and about 76% owned land. Half of the top 50 list claimed ownership over other people. In our top 50, there were more Confederates than Black people. And our study shows that monuments to men grossly outnumber those to women. Joan of Arc, Harriet Tubman, and Sacagawea are the only women in the top 50 list. There were no US-born Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, or self-identified LGBTQ plus people in the top 50. And again, you can read all of this in our full audit. As an overview, the top 50 is a glimpse into who we represent across the nation. It's not just a one-off symbol in your city or town, but it's about repetition over geography, over generations. So our call to action is to support a profound shift in representation to better acknowledge the complexity and multiplicity of this country's history. Here, a prototype monument with the artists Courtney Bowles and Mark Strandquist, On the Day They Come Home, which was a collaboration with women whose lives had been impacted by unconstitutional life sentencing or who were previously incarcerated, located at the Village of Arts and Humanities. So third finding, the most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. I have to say in the now year and a half since the audit has come out, this just continues to feel relevant and pressing. And it is something that is often not even questioned or comes up in our Q&As because it's such an expectation that people have of the monument landscape. Violence is by far the most dominant subject of commemoration. 33% of monuments captured in our audit's data set included mentions of war. You can walk through most towns and cities across this country, and the way this data lives could include statues of generals on horseback, immortalized triumphant, cannons, weaponry, other forms of instruments of war implanted into the monument landscape, or those somber, long memorial kind of roll calls of fallen rank and file soldiers carved into stone about a municipality. Despite the preponderance, the number as indicated here, our war monuments generally minimize the social and environmental costs of warfare for our veterans, for their families, for our communities, for all those who are affected. The monument landscape has long reflected the country's history of war and of conquest, and it speaks to a national crisis around harm, around trauma, around grief. We're bursting at the seams with grief, and this is an insight into this. So what will future monuments to war and conflict look like? How could we reimagine commemoration to foster greater forms of healing and repair? How do we imagine a world where, as our audit showed, for every 13 mentions of war in the monument landscape, there's one of peace. How do we imagine that we can elevate those stories of healing and repair through the programs and the processes of monumentality? Here an image of beloved documentarian Jamel Shabazz's Veterans Peace Project. Jamel himself, a veteran, photographing veterans in Newark at the city's military park, the second oldest park in this country. And finally, the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. Monuments are not facts on a pedestal. They are socio-political choices in metal and stone that suppress far more than they can summon us to remember. When we looked at our study set, we found close to 6,000 mentions of the Civil War. Of those, 1% of those Civil War monuments even mentioned slavery. That means the word slavery was found in the title, on plaques, or in the metadata kept by record keepers. The Civil War was fought over slavery, full stop. This doesn't necessarily account for the stories of self-emancipated Black folks who fought for their freedom or the legacies of slavery. This just means the word is there. Of our 1,690 mentions of Confederate in our study set, we found 3% mentioned defeat. Over half of our results for the search term pioneer in our study set were built after 1930 as part of popular culture's myth making around the frontier and the Wild West, which came after much of the forced dispossession and armed conflict with tribal communities. In other examples, we found that there were only 9 records about Reconstruction, and of those 9, only 2 seriously engaged with the critical period. I share all this to say that where inequalities and injustices exist, monuments often perpetuate them. Be really clear that when you add or take away a monument in a given context, it can be profoundly catalytic and meaningful. I think all of you can probably imagine ways that a new monument in your lifetime, or even in the last few years, or one that you've worked on, has been incredibly important, or one that has been removed, that's toxic, that's in front of a courthouse or a school building, that alleviates pain. So I don't want to undermine that, and I don't want to underemphasize that. But what I do want to say is that that approach, the one by one, it's only making dents in this larger challenge of representation. So our call to action here is to engage in a holistic reckoning with monumental erasures and lies, and move toward a monument landscape that acknowledges a fuller history of this country. And here, alongside this, a vision of the artist Sharon Hayes' If They Should Ask, a monument to the lack of women represented in public art and all the stories that live off the pedestal in Philadelphia. So through the audit, we came to this idea that we believe we can move forward by embracing the notion that monuments must change. We already know they change. They change due to weather. They change due to the surroundings. They change due to the social moment. But it's not enough to attempt to complete the monument landscape without responding to those longstanding distortions in the landscape and the histories that they've upheld. We can't look away or put this off another generation. You know, monuments need not be final points of history. They can be bridges. They can serve as portals between the past and present, sites of struggle to figure out who we are as a nation, who we are as a community, who we want to become. They can be places where we commune with the living and the dead, the exalted and the downtrodden, the official power brokers and the grassroots coalitions, who all aim to collectively make their mark. In other words, monuments can be reimagined as places where we encounter the past, present, and future together, and we can appreciate their value in the kinds of healing and support they offer communities. Through new forms of monumental affirmation, creativity, resistance, we can repair and reimagine how history lives with us every day. We can envision and create a landscape that reflects our stories of plurality that can help us understand the complexities that are contested, contradictory about our cities, towns, and nation. We've hoped that this audit and our search interface have provided a tool and a launching point for further investigations and imagining monuments evolving. We also look forward to our audit, this snapshot, to becoming outdated, because in the coming years, as more studies build on this research, but also other emerging initiatives in the field spring up, that the monuments we've inherited will also be joined by a new generation. And speaking of that, I want to kind of close with a glimpse of what Monument Lab did after this audit and what we continue to kind of think through. And we have the great opportunity to work in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C. with our partners at National Capital Planning Commission, the National Park Service, and the Trust for the National Mall. I also want to call attention to an initiative that we have been working on, which thanks to support from the Mellon Foundation, allowed us to subgrant a total of $1 million across 10 public art and history projects, led by collaborative teams of artists, educators, storytellers, organizers. Each of these teams worked on a commemorative campaign rooted in the living history of their neighborhood, of their city, of their town. And this was the first iteration of this work. It has just come to, its first iteration has come to a close. We are completing a book on this. You can see a video on our website. But I want to just kind of give a pause on this. I think, you know, in our senses, like, this is not just prototyping monuments, but prototyping the kind of efforts that municipalities on the state, the federal, the local level can engage, giving people resources on the ground for doing the work they're already doing, commemorating, truth-telling, collecting, and engaging the past, present, and future. This was curated through an open call. We received over 230 applications from a remarkable group of people, and we had to do the work of distilling this down with the help of a jury. But just you think, across the country, this has included whether it is the work in the city we now call LA, led by Tongva artists, the first peoples of the area, to imagine how to work with a cultural easement from the city, especially in a location where a former colonial monument once stood, to make a Tongva cultural center. In Montgomery, Alabama, Michelle Browder and her team at the Morup campus create a image against the backdrop of a city that claims itself as the birthplace of civil rights and the cradle of the Confederacy, a monument, as she's called it, the Mothers of Gynecology, that aim to reckon with Black maternal wellness and health and open up new spaces and pathways for healing. Or I think about the work of Consensus here in my hometown of Philadelphia, led by poet laureates Yolanda Wisher and Trapita Mason, who said, as in the city that is known for resounding around freedom and democracy in this country, the voice of Black women and femme poets in the city as historical sources should not be lost under the shadows of major historical buildings, but to appreciate the contributions, and have gathered together data about the stories of women and femme poets, in particular, to create new forms of memory. So as I close, I just want to close on this note that there is big and small ways to do this work every day. Whether it is grappling with the monuments that you've inherited, or unearthing new monuments, or something in between. I want to just share again that as we're thinking about our places of memory, from the most prominent on the National Mall to those that are prominent in our own cities and towns, think of the vital role that memory plays in connecting us, in marking where we've been and where we're headed. We're reminded of that power of public art and history to shape the circumstances, the challenges, and the possibilities for transformation. If we seek a nation that lives up to its creed, that learns from and labors to repair its past, and connects to history in ways that are more truthful, complex, vital, then our monuments must change with us. On that note, thank you.
All right, thanks. We do have questions coming in. So again, please feel free to type questions in, folks, as you think of them. Here, let's see my face. Let me see if I can get my face going. There we go. All right. So I guess the first question that I want to ask, just to sort of kick things off, or to kind of get our headspace right, when we're talking about kind of the monuments that exist right now, I look at it like, well, yeah, it's a bunch of white men. Well, yeah, it's mostly about war, because they are historical monuments for the most part. And giving that like historical context, it makes sense. So I guess though, moving forward, what do you feel like is going to be the trend? So when we're here talking in another 50 years, right? What are we going to be saying about what's happening right now in terms of monuments? What are you seeing right now? What type of monuments are popping up? And is attention being paid to others than, war heroes?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I just want to take a step back. I'm thinking about this collective experience that all of us have experienced in different ways, pandemic, and what it means to understand how profound that has been for us. You don't need me to say that, you know it, you feel it. The fact that we're gathering here today in this forum tells us something about that. Public health is not something that is a predominant form of public memory. When you look at the stories of, for example, World War I, studies have shown that the influenza pandemic was profoundly fatal in ways that rivaled battlefield deaths. That's not represented in our monument landscape. That's not something that we had whether it was, can't speak for everyone, but the priorities, the wherewithal, the goals of that. If you think about from that framework, as you said, there's history implicated in monuments, but they're not put up for peer review. They're not tested in that way. They're statements of power and presence by people who have had the time and the wherewithal to build them. There are monuments that are handmade and crafted and tell you about a place and time, but there's also monuments that have been mass produced, that are created in factories. Mechanized labor allowed for kind of massive changes in the way that monuments are made. So I think even just, I want to kind of pause just on that notion of like what monuments have shown us is something meaningful it is also a sliver of experience. For every monument that you see, there's always a question of what or who is not cast in that light. So we go forward with that notion. I think part of what I've seen from artists, from municipalities, is trying to balance two things together, which is presence and absence. And let me just say a little bit about what that means. So presence, of course, is about taking up space, taking up space physically, taking up space in the narrative. In the case of monuments, going high, being in prominent places, like thinking about presence as a way through weight, through material, through location, like shining a spotlight. In fact, many also need a spotlight so you can see them at night. Absence, on the other hand, is something different. Absence is a wound, is a void. On a metaphorical level, it's about who's missing, who's not there. Sometimes that's accounted for in the monument landscape, in the roll calls of names, but even those are hard. Anytime, for those who've led a process on this call, that it's hard. Like, who has the official name of those who are impacted and go on? But absence operates in other ways as well. What was on the ground before a monument was dedicated there? What are the numerous stories that happen? If you think about, in Richmond, Virginia, what was termed by activists on the ground Marcus David Peters Circle, on what was then known as Robert E. Lee Circle, you can't tell the story of Richmond without the story of the projections of the activism. The New York Times called it the most important piece of protest art since World War II. That is not still standing in the city. And so I think that part of what I want to highlight here is that, monument is this, like I said, a complex term. It is an insight, a window into a number of different dynamics. And please note, for the purpose of audit and to talk here, that I'm using lots of using monument and monument landscape to talk about a lot of different components, and the arguments over what is a monument versus a memorial, what is public art versus a monument, are really fascinating. And I'm glad to dive into some of them in the Q&A. But what I will say is, monuments often pass that kind of like quick hit test. There is nothing inherently that is a monument. There are things that we call monuments, that we treat as monuments. And I think in that regard, to just kind of close out your great question, which had layers and multitudes to it as well, I think that what I find is that when sponsors of monument or memorial projects not only account for presence and absence, account for the evolution of the story to leave the imprint on those who leave imprints of those who made it and those who may add to it later, those are the most compelling projects from my standpoint. Every community and locality should make sure it follows its own protocols. But just to note, we know the monuments will change. So how do we anticipate and build that into our symbols and our systems?
Thank you. And there are a lot of questions about the difference between monuments, murals, all the things. And we'll kind of maybe summarize that in a couple of questions. Another question. In this one, in your categories, doing this kind of audit, it says, it appears the category war and weaponry is lumped in with monuments that reflect patriotism. One example would be a monument commemorating our independence from England. Maybe there's a fine distinction there, but it appears there's a slant that all war is bad. War is difficult and takes a toll. But I know veterans who say they would do it all again. So maybe this lends itself more to a bigger question of how did you determine the categories and lumping certain types of what we consider to be monuments into the categories that they are?
Yeah, there's a lot to this question, and thank you for this question. And I think, this is something I try to highlight in the presentation, that in our conversations with veterans and their families and their constituencies, like this conversation about commemoration is so vital. And I think like there's multitudes that have nothing to do with our audit but our audit is embedded in, which is this question of how do we tell the story of war before? How do we tell it ongoingly? And I think of like some really powerful conversations I had a few years ago with cadets at West Point through their history department and their English department, where they were asking themselves, like before there are memorials to the most contemporary wars, like how they were reading novels and doing kind of their own conversations about where to find places to heal, to come to terms. So it's just, I'm glad to highlight that. In terms of the categories here, we tried as much as possible to just follow what the data told us, so that there are moments where we had to interpret and we had to have the data speak together. But those categories, for example, are largely ones that we gathered from the data sources itself. I think that it is really difficult to, and I invite anyone, if they want to go like splice and dice or try to arrange it in a different way, by all means go for that. What I will say is that even drawing the boundary about what is not, what is war, what we tried to do is, like a horse, for example, that's found in a monument is about kind of nature and ecology as much as it is about war. So any like reading the monument landscape is very tricky because there isn't one meaning per monument. There's actually many. For the purposes here, we tried to stick to categories that we encountered in the data sets to make sense of it from there.
Thank you. This is an interesting question, and I thought about this too. So we know that there has been a spotlight on many of the Confederate monuments across the country and the removal of them. So this is going to be like a 20-part question. The first part is,
Okay. I gotta get my pen out.
Right? No, I gotta get mine out, so I'm gonna start forgetting all my questions. So the first part is, what do we do with them? Like, can monuments come apart easily, or do they pretty much break and we're done? They're done for? Or should they go into museums? Like, is there a level of respect that we should still give for it as it is a piece of history, versus just throwing it in the trash can? So let's go there, and then
okay.
keep going.
I love these questions, and there's like there's layers to this because there's some practical parts and there's like some meta conceptual ones. So I have a lot to say about it. One thing I do want to say, just as a like, I'm fascinated by empty pedestals, fascinated by what they tell us and about what to do with monuments. I do want to say that as we looked, and for those who've read the audit, you may see that between the years of 2020 and 2021, we found that 99%, I think it was 99.2% of monuments did not get removed. So I often joke and say 99% of the questions I get from public audiences when I'm at a museum or somewhere is like about what do we do with the removed monuments? And I understand that they are the like visual kind of frameworks that we're kind of dealing with this, the haziness of what is reckoning and what is reimagining. But I do, before diving into what do we do, I want to highlight that because most of the struggles that I would imagine that people are on this call face is like, what do we do with the thing that isn't so clearly like so toxic? Like it's not to a traitorous figure or government, but it's not quite relevant today. Like for every monument that's in the spotlight, there's like 1,000 that are kind of just like collecting dust and pigeon droppings. And you're kind of like, what do I do with this thing? It's like in many ways, other forms of either outmoded or questionable public infrastructure. Like, oops, we lost the deed. Who owned this land? What is buried underneath it? Like, I think the more that we think about the monuments and public art we've inherited as part of public architecture and the built environment, we can actually have more creative responses, because that's where preservationists, that's where planners have figured out ways to balance history. And, it's common to have adaptive reuse in our architectural spaces, but monuments have eluded that. So this question of what we do with them, I have a few just kind of notes I want to put out there, but like we could do a webinar just on that. So I want to highlight a few notes. One of them is just in terms of that practicality of like, can you move them? They're not all made the same, but what I have seen, and in both like with my own eyes and speaking to folks who have been doing the work on the ground, is that they're often held up in pretty precarious ways. Like they're meant to last, but there might be 2 bolts. They might be made in 2 or 3 pieces. There are a large number, not all, but a large number that were mass produced and they at one point shipped by rail or commerce. And So it's not uncommon to see them move, right? Think about all of the things that we have moved across our society. So like moving a monument, there are some that would be delicate or crumble, but I would argue like the sensitivity that we put around moving a monument is one that we often don't put to, say, like preserving a neighborhood. For example, I've heard people say many times like if we remove a monument, we are tearing down history, as if you've erased every book, documentary, and curricula about a person, one of their many monuments. But you don't say the same thing about a neighborhood, especially a Black or brown neighborhood in a city. So, I want to put that out there. I think in terms of examples, there's some really amazing work happening in a few places. One, LAX Art and MoCA in LA are planning a show where they are going to be exhibiting some of the monuments that have been removed, especially those relating to the Lost Cause Confederacy, alongside artistic interpretations. Monument Lab is going to be doing a public classroom to help offer content and stories about them. And then there's a number of great examples, but there's one example I would point people to, which is the Citadel in Berlin. If you look it up, it's Citadel or Zitadel, like with a Z. And I wrote my first book about Americans in the Berlin Wall, and as a queer Jewish person, I'm aware of the weight of history. In Germany, they have a place that is not celebrating the culture of monuments. It doesn't take delight in the past, but they have a repository for toxic monuments from us. You don't walk into that space thinking that these are romanticized. They are preserved in a way that is commensurate with the amount of money that should go to preserving them, as opposed to money that should go for education or new projects. But I do think it's possible to preserve some of these monuments. But I also want to point out that there are lots of ways to teach something historically without needing to have object upright, held in a place of regard and security. I would love to see kind of the understanding of evolution, right? The same way that we've done with historic architecture, to see monuments, not just as one-offs, but as a whole, how we understand they will evolve and shape and be reshaped over time.
Thank you. Next, part 2 of this question is, do you have examples of kind of now irrelevant or not pertinent monuments that we could add something to again make it relevant? Or is it sort of we're done?
It's a great question, and I think I can offer answers from my point of view, but I also want to highlight with a little bit of a notice that I don't believe there's a single fix to our monument question. Like, I don't think that there can be one idea, one premise. It really is something that's a combination of local knowledge, expertise, and I mean that in the broadest senses, right? Intergenerational, intersectional, non-professional as well, and the understanding that you build across locations. So I think just with that in mind, that caveat in mind, I do think it's worth having conversations within municipalities or other regions about like, what is a no-go? Like what is a societal harm that indicates some kind of reckoning or reimagining must happen, whether that includes the removal, right? Because I think we get pitted at the like, should we keep them all or should we tear them all down? And I think that that's not necessarily driving us forward. That actually binds us in a kind of challenge. So it might be that in one local community, the stories of Indigenous communities is really important to know who was an architect of Indigenous erasure or displacement, and to understand that, or someone who may have had, in another instance, like someone who is a part of systems of violence. Like what are the values that you're actually upholding today, and how does that correspond to the monument landscape? And then I believe that there should be all kinds of tools that we use. And this is where it's challenging, where like there's a big aim for imagination, but there's not always the resources and budgets for it. We all know that whether it's planning departments or municipal art offices, that we are often undervalued, but like financially, but used as the the backdrop for press conferences and new policy imagining. So what I would say is that sometimes new signage could be added. I advise like municipal art workers especially to try to come up with solutions that are not just signage, because signage resorts to a kind of fixing that is inward and quiet. And it could be you have a sign that's the size of a billboard. You could, so signage doesn't have to be small, but it's a challenge. So what I often will say is, rather than just do we keep it up or tear it down, you could ask what kind of maintenance funds are being used. And the maintenance funds might not be from the planning office or from the art office, but it might be the Parks and Rec. And what if you stopped mowing the lawn, or you turned off the lights, or you use the lights that are currently pointing up to monuments and either put inserts or projection? I think it all comes down to, what do you want to resource? Like, if it's important, if the city has a policy that they really want to support artists and creative commerce, like, you could do that. These artists do a lot with a little. And so the last thing I would say is that, like, one of the best ways to kind of solve this problem on a local level, on a micro level, is not only to speak to communities, but to speak to artists. Like, artists do a lot with a little. They sense things that and manifest things. And what I have found is that when artists are not brought in at the end, but artists are brought in the beginning or the middle, and they actually can help shape the solutions that you are and the endeavors that you're going through, that's a way to do this. So I think lots of options on the table. I could talk through like some of the best ones and my favorite ones, but I just want to highlight that if you just have two options and they are just keep it up or tear it down, that can always be supplemented. There's so much in between that. And for any of my gardeners out there, like, if you want to get rid of a weed, something that is in your garden, what do? You clip the top or you rip out the root? And I think for us to think like the rush to make a problem go away, like if we know that we have a problem of challenge in our cities and towns, like what's the root of it? And how can we work with coalitions to understand that in multiple ways? So it's not just symbols or systems, it's both together.
Thank you. I'm going to just kind of use Confederate monuments as an example because it's the easiest one. What other types of monuments have you seen in all of your research that have had anything near a close following for removal, as which we know only like 1% are actually removed or something ridiculous like that? But is there any other trend going around of a type of a monument or a message of a monument that you're seeing is kind of collecting interest for the removal of?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I mean, there's a few ways to think through this. And again, I think I'll say these are fundamental questions that not just municipalities, but colleges and universities and museums are dealing with. So one area that's really important to think through is around both Indigenous representation and Indigenous displacement. I think, as I noted in the audit, and something I can make clearer, that whenever we saw a pioneer monument in our study set, only 15% of the time was the word Indian, Indigenous, or Native American included. That didn't include the pejorative terms, which means that we present pioneers or founders as if they had a tabula rasa, that no one was there. And that includes not just this ancient history. We're talking about communities, tribal communities that are still here. So I think about a lot of the work, and I especially think of folks like the Land Under the Plinth in LA, the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Memorial Project in Rapid City, South Dakota, Walking with Dineta in the area we now call the Four Corners, as some of the examples that really highlight this. I mean, I could tell you this comes up all the time. Anecdotally, I was just at a college not far from here in New Jersey who said, well, we have this mural on our campus that portrays a treaty between the local Indigenous community and colonial founders, that like the treaty wasn't honored, but it like acknowledged, kept in perpetuity, but this artwork, we don't know what to do with it. And so I think that that's a huge area. I think another one, of course, as we come up upon the 250th birthday of our country in 2026, I'm going to be leading a session with educators and historians next week. Like, what do you do with the fact that the legacies of freedom and enslavement are intertwined in this country? Monument Lab is working on a project called Declaration House in Philadelphia, where a national park site, Declaration House, marks a location where Thomas Jefferson and a 14-year-old enslaved valet, Robert Hemings, spent the summer of 1776 while the Declaration was being written, at a time where a passage in the Declaration was drafted and then removed, talking about slavery and its harms on the colonies. So I think that, I bring that up because that's a legacy of enslavement. The last thing I'll just say about this kind of what to do with the past, sometimes this comes up as pardon this reference, but if you remember Where's Waldo? Let's find that messed up monument and let's pluck it away and then we'll be done. And I think what increasingly we find, we get very inspired by people working at a municipal level who are like, wait, how did we get the monuments that we got? What's our policy on gifts? What do we actually know about this, so that they move forward in another way? Because it's not just about finding the one problematic one. For those environmental practitioners out here, a term we often use in our work is remediation. Like, if you have a brown field or you have a toxic site and you want to imagine a future for it, you don't just build on top of it. You remove the toxicity of the soil so people can have a life there. And what's the equivalent for public memory? Like, if something is removed because it's problematic, because it's harmful, because it's toxic, what is a process so that not just for those people, but for a generation to come or more, we can imagine a new way?
Thanks. All right, let's talk a little bit of framing here for us as planners. We have almost 400 planners or planning adjacent friends on the line today. Where exactly do we fit into this conversation? What can we do to assist with the conversation, whatever that might be, whether it be, community members are calling for the removal of a monument, or a city official wants a monument of themselves? Like, where I'm sure it's a thing.
That's not the first and not the last.
So I guess where do we fit in? And this is like big picture, and then I'm going to have a couple sub questions underneath.
Okay,
so
I love it.
Go big
I love
picture
it.
on me.
Yeah, no, I love this. And I just want to say a shout out to all of my planner friends, old and new, from this call. I'm so excited for this question, because I feel like the monument field, the monument sector is not a thing. There's no one group of people. We're all in our own ways contributing to what monuments could be and what role they play. And I just think about this idea, largely we inherited from, whether it's the City Beautiful movement or urban renewal, that you have the vista of a monument is meant to be seen from far away, maybe by automotive. It's meant to, you're meant to be small in front of it. And it, in some ways, is frozen above you. And what I am so inspired by are the moments, and I mean protests for sure, but even the mundane moments where people just set up shop, sit down on a monument and make it their own. They climb on it. They go in the fountain. They plug into the outlet that has the power for the lights. Imagine a monument not as just a vista to be seen, but as a pedestal in of itself, as a portal, as a platform. What happens if you reverse your gaze? Is that a lonely monument, or is that a welcoming monument? Is that one that's contributing to an identity of a city or of a town that encourages people to come up to it, to spend time with it? Is it comfortable? Is there seating? Is it grand and immense in magnitude, but there's no ramp for people in wheelchairs or bikes or strollers or to get up it, right? So I think that for the planners out there, you have all either lived in or encountered spaces that repel you. I live in Philadelphia, and we have the Grand Parkway with our art museum on one end. I just did my statue podcast about Rocky. And we are 100 years past the building of the Parkway. And we're like, how many times have we had a design competition run to reimagine the Parkway, to have more park and less way? So like, that's monumental in a sense. It's a statement of power and presence. Planners can help us understand not just how to repair and remediate and redress those sites that we have, but to now build in new ways, to think about what our cities will look like, not just from the point of view of a few years from now, but a generation. I also have a lot of empathy for my municipal planners out there. And this is true of my municipal art workers and et cetera, who work in the time frame of a mayoral term. Because like, you know how monuments get made sometimes? That mayor says, I think there should be a permanent monument to you fill in the blank. And then someone like is reading the newspaper that morning and sipping their like tea or coffee and then spits it out. And it's like, wait, me? Because it's the municipal worker that's then charged with figuring out, where do I draw the budget from? How does this fit into my plan? So I just think from a perspective of planners, imagine the city from your eyes. Imagine that the history of a city is constantly evolving. You can value the past and make room for other stories. And then be in coalitions with people. You know, you can always reach out to Monument Lab, but think about who's already doing this work in your city. Anyone who's interested in a memory or a history conversation in the city, you very well likely are not the first person. So find your people. That's my biggest note. Find your people. People are intrigued. Sometimes they are pleading for this, but they're energized when they're involved. And I know how hard it is to run a public process, but I want to just put out a word: relationship. Relationships that are not built because you have a deadline or because you have an RFP, but relationships built because you are seeing the city or town from someone's perspective and they are seeing it from yours. So I want to get your backs and remind of the important work you do. And I want to kind of shout out what those can do from the ground up as well.
So in many communities in their zoning ordinances, there might be a sentence or two regarding the regulation of monuments, but other than that, I can't really say that it's probably that much. You know, it's not like there's a whole chapter in their comprehensive plan about monuments. If there is, please send me those links because I would like to see
send
them.
me too. I would like to know them.
So I guess if we're, as planners, we find our people, you know, we find the advocates, perhaps a couple council persons, maybe the local historical society, and you're all together in a room and you're like, we want to create some kind of, not protocol, but guidelines for moving forward, or, you know, kind of evaluating what we have. Maybe you want to take stock, maybe you have more than one monument, so you want to take stock, kind of have a baseline and move forward with the types of monuments you might be interested in having, you know, be represented. What are the kinds of things that you want to put into this conversation or into this manual for moving forward? Yeah,
I'm going to answer it in my way, but I have to say, I'm also curious, like, to be a fly on the wall, a ladybug on the shoulder, to like think like, what's coming up here? Like, what's the thing that's both exciting or tapping a nerve? Like, it's worth, I know it's so hard to like, this work is so intense, but I don't know, I've seen catharsis happen when there's room for people to speak and hear and share and learn, and expectations are set. Like, rather than being like, what do you want? What's the big picture? Yeah, that's great. But like, what's the parameter? What are we trying to figure out? How do we, you know, promise properly and then over deliver? I mean, the biggest thing, this is my wish list, right? So this is just a wish list. I don't know how it will happen, but like, one of them, I want to talk about time. And I'm going to get like philosophical for a moment, but something I have seen in municipal definitions are this definition of what permanent means. And I've noted this, like, there are some cities that say permanent artwork, asterisks. After 10 years, all of our bronze sculptures need restoration. That's not permanent. That just means 10 years. Maybe it's 20 years. Maybe it's delineated by material. Maybe it is something else, right? But this idea, and it's not across the board, but I'd be really curious how time is measured, because look, we're not in planning and building and the built environment. We're not alone in the way we use the word permanent as a placeholder for a lot of other terms. I've talked to colleges and universities that say that. I've talked to museums that have a permanent collection. I love the permanent loan is like the ultimate oxymoron of what that means. Power is embedded in definitions of time. And so what would happen if you're thinking about building something that's meant to last generations? You're thinking, you know, especially as there are more public art that have some kind of robotic or computerized or digital element. Like I've had municipalities like have a company they contracted with for a so-called permanent piece of art, and the company went defunct. And like, what do you do when you don't have the backlog of light bulbs or circuit boards? So I think a really frank understanding of time, like that has to do also with the rhythms of healing and the rhythms of history. There are a lot of moments where the conversation about a city's so-called founder is both about 100, 200 years ago or 300 years ago, but it's also about what happened last mayoral election or what happened last summer or what happened in a previous moment. So I think like really understanding time, but I talked about that in a philosophical way. I want to talk about it in a practical way. So in these conversations, sometimes we have city planners who are hired in ways that transcend a mayoral term. Some are bound by a mayoral term. Some are hired beyond a mayoral term, but their bosses are bound on a mayoral term. Sometimes there are academics in the room who want to bring their students or their studios, and studio time and semester time is different than community time. So one of the ways that you bring out this conversation on time is actually in scheduling. Like, when is the time where people can meet? What is a forum that this can happen? And I know that studies have shown that community meetings, sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, that those who have the ability to speak more speak louder. But I do think about this relationship building. So I will highlight time. The only other thing I will highlight is being as transparent as you can about money. Like if you say to someone, we want to reimagine this part of town or this highway, we have $3,000 to do it this summer. Like, go ahead and say we want to plan an amazing pizza party and barbecue. And how would we do that? Because that might get you to the long term. But I think that sometimes it can feel like gauche or inappropriate. I'm just a fan of being very upfront about the funding that's available and the responsibilities. Your job may have a responsibility to spend money on a fiscal year basis for let's say. So how do you communicate and translate that to someone where that's not their problem to solve for you, but you do need each other to understand? So I'm going to those kind of philosophical moments because I think they have ties to practicality, which is timing and transparency around funding.
Okay, in our last 10 minutes, I would like to talk logistically about the difference between monuments, murals, all the things. We talked a little bit about like what is considered permanent or not permanent. But before we do that, I guess we've had a lot of webinars in the past, especially regarding murals that come into communities and the extent to which we can regulate them. In your experience, what level of regulation do communities have regarding monuments? And then after that, really define what we call a monument,
Yeah,
and all the other things too. But
oh my
first,
gosh,
I guess
there's so much to that because I would say there isn't one definition. Again, I think in large part because things that are considered monuments, when you look into categories or names, like they include things that may embody the form of a statue. They may be a park, they may be a baseball field, they may be a highway, they may be a plaque next to all those things, maybe 3 plaques. So really part of the way you follow that is who's responsible for it. But I don't want to even put that out there as something firm, because have anyone here been to a civic meeting where you're talking about it could be something like a plaque, but it could be anything, and you're at a table and everyone's pointing at each other like, wait, you're in charge of that? Are you in charge of that? Well, I'm in charge below the ground. Well, I'm in charge up in the air. But who's in charge in the in-between, right? So I think the same considerations like art dramatizes those conversations that often are transacted around jurisdiction or property line. So I'll give an example around murals. What happens when a homeowner has given sanction to a municipal arts program to use their city funding to paint a mural next to a currently vacant lot, and then a private real estate developer says, I'm going to build a house here. Like the way that gets solved now, largely, though I'd welcome examples from you all, but largely is like a battle between the property owner and the municipal arts program, if that municipal arts program has a voice. You know, I think of like an example in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, with like a really historically relevant Keith Haring, who's, you know, the pillow right back there, a mural that he painted in the 80s that we're talking not like a few years later, we're talking like a generation later, and there's a question of how it will remain visible. So I think that this is a great area for planners to help innovate. You know, I know of the percent for art mandate that a lot of cities have. Philadelphia was the first city to do that. I've always wanted to see a percent for redevelopment. Like if you're going to, and sometimes this happens necessarily, right? It's not all murals are meant to be there forever. Jane Golden from the Philadelphia Mural Arts program has said like there's mural heaven sometimes, but how do you honor what happened to build that in a way that might bring about a new opportunity to build a new piece of public art? And that new piece of public art, by the way, doesn't necessarily have to be the same mural on your house or on your building, but is nonetheless making sense of the municipal investment that went in, that is both about financial dollars and about trust, right? And so I think that that's really key to think through here. I want to make sure I answer that question before going to the definitions one too, because it's a good one.
In terms of, did we finish that? I think we finished that part. I'm satisfied. In terms of definitions, what do we need to know? Like what, I mean, you know, without getting into the weeds, what are the things that are most important? Otherwise, anything else?
Yeah. I mean, from my standpoint, I want to be really clear. I can speak for Monument Lab to a degree, though my team is wonderful and get to know them. I can speak for myself. I'm intrigued here in this strange webinar where there's lots of people in this imaginary auditorium on the other side of my home office.
They're there, I promise.
Yeah, I'm seeing you. So I think, let me try to answer this in the way that I find it important, but I'm really eager to hear how it plays out in other people's work and lives. There are some textbook definitions of monument, memorial, public art, mural, that are really interesting and exciting to talk with and I say this term lovingly because I identify as one, word nerd. People who really want to understand the definitions of it. And sometimes those definitions, like word nerding, there's a lot at stake. Sometimes it's about a financial allotment. Sometimes it's about jurisdiction. Those are really interesting conversations to have in our APA webinars, in our classrooms, you know, in our books. But I will tell you, in the public realm, when we've asked people, like, what's an appropriate monument for a city? Sometimes we get the answer of something that's conventional monument, and sometimes we hear about something else. Like in Philadelphia, where there's 4,000 murals, people think of murals as monuments. They think of mosaics as monuments. And they're reckoning with what a monument means, but they see it as a place where the past, present, and future collide. I know that there are tendencies within monuments and memorials to be distinct. A monument is meant to proclaim a civic virtue or value that you want to propel into the future, and a memorial is meant to be a place that you mourn, that you grieve. I will tell you that there are monuments that are fundamentally about grieving. They might not tell you in the title. And the flip side, memorials often do inscribe what our visions and values are in their wording and their design. So for the purposes of the audit, we did not take on that divide. Someone else should go ahead and do that. I think that's a fantastic project. But for us, monument landscape was a way to classify. And what I will tell you, and this is based on both like conversations with my dear colleagues, as well as people who I meet in public spaces when we staff a project, the distinctions of definition are not as compelling as the issues at hand. So if an issue at hand is about what visions and values do we want to put forward and take up space in our cities, that's very compelling. If it's about how we grieve, how we address the loss and tragedy, and we try to find spaces of mourning and healing, let's do it. I don't necessarily think the definition between these entities will get us there, but I don't want to throw cold water on it either, because to me, and this is a final note about public art, there are public art pieces that I would call monuments and those that I wouldn't. And it's so granular, like who the people ask that question, like, let's go on a walk through a city and like debate it, because it's a really interesting one. But to me, public art is not just art that's outside. It's art that shares an ethos with public education, public health, public policy, public well-being, which is that its place in this world, in our cities and towns, is about the collective. It's about collective resources and wherewithal and understandings, the impossibility of the universal to tell a story. There's no one story in any of these public platforms, but it's the question, the goal, the hope that by being embedded in the public sphere, the public sector, that art can be a part of this kind of ecosystem of belonging, and try to get at these other modes of being together, of healing, of coming to terms with the many and the one and the one and the many.
Thank you. We're out of time already.
Wow.
This was
Amazing.
really good. And there are still a ton of questions left. So
I'm sorry to folks who weren't able to get to your questions. We try to channel as much as we can, but I hope you follow Monument Lab, or you can support our work. And we're always looking out there for that. So I'm so grateful that you were here today as well.
Thank you, Paul. And the Urban Design and Preservation Division, Lauren, and the Arts and Planning Division, Brittany. Thanks for joining us and for bringing this together and for bringing us Paul. We appreciate it. We are recording this session. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel, probably sometime on Monday. And make sure that you register for all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Bye. See you next
Thank
time.
you.